The desert wind howls across the ruins of an ancient city. Dust swirls where once kings walked, and in that silence, a forgotten voice still echoes, a voice that spoke not to thousands, but to a handful, a prophet whose words were not written in fame, but carved into eternity. Most of us know Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. But what about the others? The ones whose names hide between the pages? The ones who cried out, and no one listened? This is their story. The prophets nobody talks about. The year was around 580 BC. Jerusalem had fallen. The people were scattered, broken, humiliated. But one man stood between two brothers' hatred. His name was Obadiah. We almost skip over his book. It's just one chapter, barely 20 verses. But in that small space, God spoke judgment that would echo for centuries. Obadiah was sent to Edom, descendants of Esau, Israel's own bloodline. But when Jerusalem was burning, Edom watched and laughed. They looted their brother's city. They took what was left. And God said through Obadiah, "You stood aloof while your brother fell. You rejoiced over his destruction. But the day of the Lord is near for all nations." Obadiah's voice thundered in the silence of betrayal. He was never famous. He didn't perform miracles. He didn't confront kings. But his message was about justice, about the God who sees even the smallest act of cruelty. His words whisper today, when nations turn against their brothers, when pride blinds compassion, God sees, God remembers, and He will set things right. When you feel unseen, remember Obadiah, the prophet whose short message still cuts through time. But Obadiah wasn't alone in the shadows. Another prophet stood quietly at history's edge, a man who asked a question so raw it still shakes heaven. The land was falling apart. Violence, corruption, injustice, and Habakkuk did what few dared to do. He argued with God. "How long, Lord? Must I call for help, and you do not listen?" His prayer was a cry we all know too well, the cry of someone who believes, but doesn't understand. God answered, but not the way Habakkuk expected. "I am raising up the Babylonians," God said, "a ruthless nation." Habakkuk was stunned. "How can you use them?" he asked. "They're worse than us." And in that storm of confusion, God gave him a vision. "The righteous shall live by faith." That single line would echo across centuries, shaping the faith of Paul, the heart of Martin Luther, and the hope of every believer who ever doubted. Habakkuk ended not with despair, but with a song. "Though the fig tree does not blossom, and there are no grapes on the vine, yet I will rejoice in the Lord." From questioning to worship, from fear to faith. Sometimes faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting when the sky stays silent. And in that silence, Habakkuk teaches us. God's plans are bigger than our pain. Before Nineveh was destroyed, it was saved. Jonah's story is well known. But after 100 years, Nineveh fell back into violence and pride. Then came Nahum, the prophet of God's justice. He walked the same roads Jonah once walked, but this time, there was no mercy left. His words thundered like war drums. "The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. He will not leave the guilty unpunished." Nahum's prophecy wasn't about revenge. It was about relief. For generations, the Assyrians had crushed Israel, and Nahum declared, "Never again will they invade you." He wasn't just announcing destruction. He was announcing freedom, the end of an empire that oppressed God's people. Sometimes God's justice looks like the walls falling down. Sometimes His mercy looks like a storm ending tyranny. Nahum reminds us that evil may roar for a season, but it never lasts forever. And just when it feels like God forgot His people, He rises with justice in His wings. But hidden among these men was one whose voice almost disappeared entirely. His book is only a few lines. his story barely told. Yet his message burns brighter than gold. A man named Haggai. The temple lay in ruins. The songs of Jerusalem had fallen silent. The people had returned from exile, but their hearts were tired, distracted, building their own houses, while God's house lay in dust. Then Haggai spoke. His words were simple, but they hit like lightning. "Is it time for you to live in paneled houses, while this house lies in ruin?" The people stopped. The hammer fell silent. Every worker looked at their unfinished homes. Through Haggai, God whispered something deeper, not about buildings, but about priorities. "Consider your ways," he said. "You plant much, but harvest little. You eat, but never have enough." The message cut to the soul. When you forget God, even success feels empty. And the people listened. They rebuilt. Stone by stone, they lifted their faith again. And God said, "I am with you." Then came the promise that still gives chills. "The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former." It wasn't just about a temple. It was about every heart that feels broken beyond repair. God can rebuild it stronger. He can fill it with greater glory than before. If you've ever felt like your best days are behind you, Haggai's voice whispers through the ages. They're not. The latter will be greater. But hope didn't stop with Haggai. Another prophet rose beside him, younger, quieter, but carrying visions that reached to eternity. Zechariah was a visionary. While Haggai rebuilt with hands, Zechariah rebuilt with dreams. He saw horses of fire, a flying scroll, a golden lampstand, visions that confused kings, but comforted the weary. Through them, God was saying, "I have not forgotten Jerusalem." Zechariah's words were laced with hope, "Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit," says the Lord. He saw a king coming, not on a war horse, but riding on a donkey. Centuries later, Jesus fulfilled that exact vision. Zechariah spoke of a pierced Messiah, a fountain opened for sin, and a coming day when the Lord would reign over all the earth. He lived in the rubble of disappointment, yet saw the light of redemption. His story reminds us, even when you stand among ruins, God can show you a vision of restoration. Faith is not blindness. It's sight beyond the visible. And Zechariah was the prophet who saw tomorrow while standing in the ashes of yesterday. But not every prophet had visions of hope. Some spoke words of coming judgment, terrifying, unavoidable, and yet drenched in mercy. It started with a swarm. Millions of locusts devouring everything in sight. Fields vanished overnight. The air buzzed with destruction. Joel stood in the midst of it. To him, it wasn't just nature, it was a warning. "The day of the Lord is coming," he cried. "Blow the trumpet in Zion." The people thought it was just another disaster, but Joel saw deeper. He saw a spiritual famine, hearts as empty as their fields. And yet, in the middle of devastation, God spoke through him. "Return to me with all your heart. Rend your heart, not your garments." Then came the promise that changed history. "I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams." Centuries later, on the day of Pentecost, Peter stood before the crowds and said, "This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel." A forgotten man, in a forgotten time, foretold the moment when heaven would touch earth. Joel's locusts turned to revival. His despair became the blueprint for hope. When everything you built is eaten away, remember Joel. Because God can turn your emptiness into an outpouring. The prophets spoke in deserts, in ruins, in the courts of kings, and in the corners of exile. But one prophet, one final voice, broke through them all. He stood alone on the edge of history, his message bridging the silence between old and new. His name was Malachi. The temple was rebuilt. The songs had returned. But the people's hearts had grown cold again. They went through the motions, offering sacrifices, reciting prayers, but their love for God was fading. And then a final voice rose. Malachi. He was not loud, he was not dramatic, but his words pierced deeper than a sword. "You bring me your blind animals," God said through him, "your leftovers, your scraps. Would you offer that to your governor?" It wasn't about lambs or altars, it was about the heart behind them, a generation that had forgotten why they worshipped. And yet, even in his correction, God spoke with tenderness. "Return to me, and I will return to you." Malachi reminded them. God wasn't asking for perfection, he was asking for sincerity. Then came the whisper that ended the Old Testament. "Behold, I will send my messenger to prepare the way before me." That messenger would come 400 years later, crying in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." John the Baptist, the bridge between silence and salvation. Malachi's voice faded into history, but his final words opened the door for the greatest story ever told. Obadiah, who spoke against betrayal. Habakkuk, who questioned in faith. Nahum, who proclaimed justice. Haggai, who rebuilt hope. Zechariah, who saw redemption. Joel, who announced the Spirit. Malachi, who prepared the way. 7 prophets, 7 voices, each one carrying a piece of the heart of God. They were not famous, they didn't part seas or call down fire, but they carried messages that changed eternity. Each one reminds us that God speaks not only through the loud and powerful, but through the quiet, the forgotten, the faithful few, because every whisper from heaven, no matter how small, can shake the world. Imagine the moment. A man alone in the desert, writing words no one might read. His city burned, his people gone, his name barely remembered. Yet heaven leans down and says, "Write this." The ink dries, the scroll rolls shut, and centuries later, a child opens a Bible and reads those words. What once was a forgotten prophecy becomes a living promise. It's as if God is saying, "No voice is wasted when it speaks for me." You don't have to be known to be chosen. You don't have to be followed to be faithful. You don't have to be seen to make a difference. The prophets, nobody talks about, were never trying to be remembered. They were trying to be obedient, and in that obedience they became eternal. Sometimes we think God only moves through the famous, the pastors, the preachers, the platforms, but maybe he still speaks through the quiet ones, the single mother praying at night, the old man who still reads his worn Bible, the student who chooses integrity when no one's watching. Maybe you are today's lesser-known prophet. Maybe your act of faith, your prayer, your kindness, your truth, is echoing louder in heaven than you realize. Obadiah wasn't famous, but his courage mattered. Haggai wasn't celebrated, but his obedience rebuilt a nation. Joel wasn't remembered, but his words birthed the church. You never know what God can do with a voice that says, "Yes, Lord, I'll speak." Even if no one listens, even if no one remembers, he remembers. The wind still moves through the ruins of old cities. The scrolls are long gone, but their voices remain, because truth never dies, faith never fades, and God still speaks. Through those, the world forgets. If this story touched you, share it with someone who feels unseen, because maybe they're the next voice God will use. And if you want more stories like this, stories that awaken faith, that remind us that heaven still speaks, make sure to subscribe. Because the next story might be about you. The prophets nobody talked about are talking still.